All right, guys, Brian here with the Mustard and Mayo, and today is going to be the last major update. I think this is the fourth video from this kind of series of working on the van, at least with the serious work. But this is going to be actually my favorite, or to me, most exciting work that we're doing on the van, and that is actually replacing the both the front struts, the rear shocks, and all four of the springs with Espalier lowering springs and KYB GR2 struts. And I'm pretty excited about this because that's the last big thing that needs to be done on this van, and suspension work is probably my favorite thing to do on any car. Obviously this car has coilovers. My Celica over here has got a pretty nice Coney setup, but it was on there beforehand. My MR2, which is over there way in the distance, has coilovers. Even my daily driver kind of like beater Hyundai over here, I've replaced the suspension just with new units. So I have to take speed bumps pretty slowly as well, just because when I come down off the speed bumps, the front kind of likes to crash down and the suspension collapses up, and it's not fun, it's kind of painful. And before I really use this van, which again is the next big update, I want to have that done. And at the same time, I'm actually really excited to lower this van a little bit with the Espalier springs. Supposedly it should drop this van about 1.5 inches is what I'm told, which I think is going to be perfect. I would be willing to bet that the front sags a little bit with the worn out struts and springs, and I think the rear, I think the springs are still holding the weight okay, but there's just a ton of gap there. So if I can just level it down just a little bit, maybe improve the handling slightly. I mean, it handles pretty good for a van as it is, but if I can improve that ever so slightly while also making it a little bit more comfortable to drive and more controlled over bumps, it's a win. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start actually tearing the van apart while I wait for the parts. I do have my KYB strut tops, the top hats for the front. I do have those already. I'm still waiting for the struts and springs, but I've got FedEx tracking that says they'll be here today. So I'm going to go ahead and at least tear everything apart and have it ready for the new stuff to go in. That way it's a nice, quick, and easy job when it does show up. So let's get started. Alrighty, so sit rep, we have started doing the work. I actually, right after I made the first video, about 30 minutes later, the FedEx guy and dropped off my stuff. So as you can see, we already have the original system out here. Now, even though I pretty much have all new parts, I did have to take it apart just for the little rubber bushing that sits on the bottom of the spring and at the top of the spring, as well as I had to use the top hat, if you will, for the new setup here. So as you can see, we're on the passenger side of the Previa, and we've got the new KYB GR2 strut in. And I've got a combination. I decided to use the old boot with the new boot. I decided why not. And you can see we've got the new bump stop on here, which my other struts did not have, which is probably why it crashed so hard going over bumps. And then there's the 3 bolts up top, and I did use a new strut mount, which is also from KYB. So we've got KYB, and then KYB up top with all new hardware. Now, as for getting it off down here, it was actually really easy. We have two, I believe these are 21mm bolts. No, I'm sorry, these were two 22mm bolts. And at least on my vehicle, they actually came off really easy. I didn't have any trouble getting them off with the impact. And then you do have to, there's 2 methods for getting the brake lines away. There's actually a spot here for them and a spot back behind here also. Method A is to actually disconnect the hard line between these two and then basically feed the rubber lines up and then bolt the hard lines back in. But then obviously that requires opening up the system, and it makes a lot of mess with brake fluid everywhere. And then of course you have to bleed everything when you're said and done, which is kind of tedious and seems like a little bit more work than is absolutely needed. So the other method is just to do what I have done here, and I did this with the old ones as well. I was kind of shocked the new ones I had to do this with, because most of the time you get aftermarket units, especially coilovers and things, they have these notched already, so you don't have to cut into them. But you basically just cut right into this little bracket you can see there, and then you just take some pliers and bend this out of the way. That way when you put everything back together, these lines will just fit right back in there, and then you flatten it out straight. You just kind of make it as flat as possible, and then you put the little clips that you can see right there. You just put the little clips back in, and everything still stays held in place. So really no issues. I did have to use some spring compressors to get these close enough to where I could actually install everything back together. A lot of times I've been able to do it without spring compressors, but this time I definitely had to. And again, here's the part of that rubber bushing, which isn't in great shape, but I was able to reuse this, and the same thing for the one up top here with the spring mount. All right, so I forgot something. So obviously when I was showing you what was going back together, I forgot about the suspension end link from the sway bar up here to the strut. It was just dangling out of the way and I forgot about it, but when I put it back on, I just wanted to show you, this is the best setup for handling these things, is to use, in this case we have a 17 millimeter, and I am a huge fan of like the gear wrench or any of these ratcheting wrenches that you got here, because you can just fit it right up on there. And then there's an Allen on the inside, and the one that I happen to grab here is probably, what is this, the second to largest on this thing, so that would make it what, I don't know, I'm terrible at this. 7/32, 5/64, I don't even know. But just find the right Allen key that fits up in there, and then that way you can just lock that thing down. Very easy. But as you can see, I do have the brake lines back on with both of the clips in and everything tidied up and good to go there. So as I show you on the inside, the fronts on the Previa are a little bit different than other cars, because with the cab being so far forward, that means you actually have your strut bolts for the top inside the vehicle. So you can see inside the glove box, I just had to remove this little cover, which is right down there. I was able to pry it out with a flathead screwdriver very carefully. And then that got access to all of the 14 millimeter head bolts in there. Of course, there's 3. And I was able to fit a normal size wrench in there, normal size socket in there, and get those out no problem. So that wasn't too difficult. When we get to the driver's side over here, you can see I am gonna have to remove the underside dashboard plastic, and I believe that panel that's over here also is gonna have to come out, just so I can actually get to the same access that we have over here. But we are just about ready to put this side back together. Overall, really not a difficult time. I would say I probably spent more time just getting the new strut and spring and everything set up than it actually did for me to get everything out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna lock everything down here with these 222s, and then I'll put the brake lines back in place, put the clips in, and then go back up top for the 14 mils. And that'll take care of this side. And then what I'll do is once I have the other side taken apart and kind of reinstalled, I'll show you the difference over there with inside the dashboard, what has to come out, because I actually have to figure it out for myself. So yeah, that's where we're going. And the driver's side is done, and what a pain this is. So on the underside of the car, it is the same exact procedures. You know, you've got your 22s, you've got your brake lines, you've got the 17 and the Allen, and then, you know, you've got the same disassembly of the strut and spring when it comes out. But this is always the worst side that everybody always complains about on the Previas. So it makes it a little bit more of an expensive job if you're paying someone, and this is why. So you have to take apart the lower dashboard, and what that entails is you have the lower trim, which goes underneath of the, you can see underneath the dashboard here. It also includes the key. So you have to pop the little ring off around the ignition system, and then you have, I believe it was like one, I think there was at least 2. There's a couple little plastic covers that you have to take off. These here are the little blanks. So there's one on this side and there's one on the other side right underneath of the key that have to come off. And then basically all of the screws are on the bottom side of this. I want to say there's 4 or 5 total that would take the plastic piece out. And then you have this metal tray, this reinforcement tray that went underneath of it. And this was all 12 millimeters. And there was, let's just see here. There was one here, there was one up under there. There was at least one up underneath of here, and then another one here. And then once you have this piece out, so I think this was 4, maybe 5 12 millimeter bolts and nuts. And I've got those kind of, they're all these brass ones that are in here, brass colored ones, so they were easy to spot. And then you also have this brace, which goes between here and up here in the dashboard. And then there was another spot here. I believe it was here, maybe it's further in, maybe it's here, I don't remember now, but it'll all make sense to put it back together. So that had to come out. And then I was actually doing this without taking this air tube out, but then I was just really struggling. So I ended up pulling this air tube out, and this air tube goes between this door vent right here and back inside. I don't know if you can see, probably not because it's too dark, but the inside of it fits into right about here. There was also this box right here that I went ahead and just unclipped from where it was here, basically snapped in right here, and I pulled it off to get it out of the way. And I could have probably done the same with that little box that's back in here. Again, you probably can't see, let me see here, there we go. So you see that black box there, and now you can actually see where that air tube goes into. You can see the foam around it, but you can see this little black box right here. I could have moved out of the way, the left one there, the smaller one, but I was able to work around it okay. But I'll tell you, the biggest pain of this, you can actually see this front front bolt here really wasn't too bad. Oh gosh, let's hold it steady here. That front nut really wasn't that bad, and the second one in the middle back there wasn't awful, but man, this one over here on the far left, that one's tucked up in there. If you see this insulation here, that's got a bunch of wiring and stuff like that that runs through it, and it's pretty thick, and you have to really push it out of the way. So I had to use a combination. Those are all 14s just like the other side. I had to use a combination of things from this super handy swivel head ratchet wrench that I have, which is great because it's low profile, but it's not super long, but I was able to use this for some positive effect. And then I did have a long, low profile breaker bar that I was able to use to kind of break them free before I could actually get in there and use the smaller wrench. And then if I needed to ratchet, I basically had to grab like a 3/8 head with about as flush of a driver as I could find in my collection to especially get back in that rear one. And you really got to wedge it in there. And then, it's just awkward because you're working here, underneath I had to move the seat up out of the way. And believe it or not, the handbrake was a little easier to work around if I just lifted up, because I could then like kind of sit right here and reach in there and do all the work. So it comes out, but man, it's definitely a lot easier. I would not say this was as difficult as let's say the distributor was. Getting the distributor out on that last job, that was really just a pain, and you're laying on the ground. This was almost as bad, but not as bad. So outside of that, a couple pro tips for this job. You do have to unclip or unscrew the hood latch assembly from underneath of the plastic piece before it can come out. And if you really want to make sure it gets out of the way, you can actually tuck it up right in here. Just don't forget about it when you're putting things back together, but that actually gave me the clearance to work up underneath of here. Obviously, when we put things back together, I'll put that back with the plastic piece. And then other pro tips, this was in relation to the springs. So here are the spring compressors that I had rented from AutoZone, and they're pretty much the same anywhere you go. This is how they're going to look. On the passenger side, the first side, I ended up actually grabbing hold of like 3 springs. You can see the old one here. So I had it from basically the bottom here to about like here, which I think the new one has 1 spring less, so it would be a little bit closer than this one is. But I had 3 springs, and that gave me plenty of room for getting everything onto the new strut assembly. But I had a really hard time getting the spring compressor off once I had the top hat and everything back on. So the second time around, I just did it around 2 springs, basically the bottom 2 springs, and that way it brought the little head of that spring compressor down way further, and I was able to get my impact with basically a long extender on there, and it made my life a whole lot easier. So pro tip when you're doing this with that style spring compressor, if you can make it work, do it with 2 springs instead of 3, or at least make sure that head is as low as possible, or maybe even flip the whole thing upside down, just so it's just easier to access those adjuster nuts. So yeah, just a couple pro tips there. And just to kind of show you what we're dealing with the original struts, these are definitely the originals, and this again is a 1992 Previa. You can see right here, I mean, it's possible this has been rebuilt at some point, but it just doesn't look like that to me. Everything looks pretty original, and I'm not even sure you can actually get this apart. It looks like it's sealed for sure. But you can see here, this has got the Toyota part numbers, and it's even got all the Japanese on it, which is kind of neat. And this is what a blown strut looks like. So this doesn't take a whole lot of pressure for me to push down with my hand and arm. And then if I let it go, you can just see how slowly it comes back up, if it even comes up at all. And right now it's not, so I actually have to pull on it some. Yeah, this thing is completely blown. And passenger side was just as bad as that. So I'm gonna be very happy to have these gone. And then all I have to do now is basically just button up everything on the front here and start on the rear. And what's nice about the rear, I can go ahead and show you this. This is gonna be a much easier job. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be a total of 3 bolts roughly. So we're gonna have this one here on the bottom for the shock, and there's one up on the top that goes sideways into the body. Those are probably both 12s, maybe 14s. It looks like it looks like maybe a 12 on the bottom. But either way, we'll figure that out. And then I believe to get the spring out, all I'm gonna need to do is basically lower this spring perch that bolts to the axle here, a straight axle. And I'm pretty sure all I've got to do is just take out this one bolt that runs through that. And then I believe, this is my theory, that this arm will swing down, that spring will come out, and it'll be obviously the same for going back in, and the same will apply on the other side. So the rear should be pretty easy. I'm pretty excited. It's only like 3 bolts. So I started with the front first to get the hardest ones out of the way. And just to show you as well, this is This is why you want to replace your strut tops, your strut mounts, pretty much every time you do these, unless you know they're in good shape. So all of these have a bearing, you can see, that's right inside here. And this one looks like it's been packed with grease, like maybe it's been serviced or something, but it's definitely not been replaced from what I can tell. Because if you look on the back side, and the other one was exactly the same, these are normally supposed to be a sealed bearing. And you can see on the back side here, it is not sealed anymore. It is very much exposed, and you can actually see all the little ball bearings in there. And that's definitely not how this should be. Look how nasty and crusty that whole thing is. So that was probably just, you know, it doesn't make a huge difference, except for just kind of makes the suspension not as responsive when you're rolling and turning and going over bumps and stuff like that. Causes a little bit of hesitation, because this should be able to move just a little bit as the strut assembly moves underneath of it. Obviously it moves on the bearing, not the whole entire thing, but you get the idea. And if this bearing is, you know, either locked up, or like this one is very notchy, I can barely get it to move with my finger. That just makes it a little bit of an unsmooth suspension travel. So I'm very happy to have the new strut mounts, as well as, you know, the new bellows and all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and get these rear two swapped out, and then what I'll do is I'll kind of show you the finished product. We'll put it on the ground and be done. All right, so the left rear side is installed, and what I thought was going to be pretty easy ended up being an actual pain in the ass. So the strut itself, or the shock back here rather, was easy. There was one down here that I believe for some reason on mine was like a 15. I think the shock had been replaced before, so the bottom was a 15 millimeter, and then the top was a 14 millimeter that just goes sideways into the body there. And then once that was freed, this whole entire shock cartridge came off. And of course the old one's just as blown as this one, or just as blown as the front ones were, so that's good to be replaced. And then I was right to get the spring off. You do have to remove this one bolt here, which true to form is a 22 millimeter back here, and as well as this like almost a little 22 millimeter head here. Problem is, you definitely need to make sure you have tall enough jack stands. I'm using regular size one, which made things a little bit more difficult. I had to move things around between a couple jacks and jack stands and everything, because really you want to have this up as high as you can. So if you've got some truck jack stands, you'll be in good shape. You can do it with the smaller jack stands, but it's just not as easy. But what I needed to do was, once that bolt was out, of course it kind of kinked sideways, and what I should have done is I should have kept pressure here with the jack when I was taking it down. That way that bolt was able to come out straight, but I didn't do that. So I was able to finally get the bolt out after doing that. And then the reason why I say you need to get it really high up in the air is this arm came all the way down, and right now the car is a little bit lower from how I had it earlier, but this arm came all the way down and was touching the ground, and I actually was having some issues with, you know, fitment with the jack and everything. So but that made the spring come out pretty easily. It just popped right out from the perch. Again, I reused the top and bottom bushings. You can see them right there and right there. So those were reused in good shape there. But then of course the other thing that I had to do was put everything back together. There was, I almost forgot, there was one 12 millimeter bolt in the back of this parking brake line, so I had to undo that way that this arm could drop down all the way. So don't forget that, do that first. I did it last and I got messed up on that, so when I go to the other side over there, I'm gonna make sure to do that first. So once you've got everything free there, this will swing out of the way, and then the spring comes out. You put the new spring in, you use the jack, your extra jack, you know, whatever you've got going on, to apply some pressure here. Then the axle will kind of move up and down a little bit. It'll be kind of free to move around. That way you can kind of get things centered up back on here. And then I ended up having to kind of use a long screwdriver, like a pry tool, to kind of move the bushing inside here around to get the hole lined up so this would slide through. And then I just kind of gently tapped it in, and then was able to get the nut back on the other side. And then the final thing was getting the strut put in, or the shock put in. So I put that in up top. I still had the straps on it at that time, so it was all collapsed and ready to go. And then what I did was, when I was ready to do things, I had my bushings locked up and ready to go. And then I basically just set everything in it, unclipped it, and then let this thing open back up and pretty much lined it straight up. Now this KYB gas adjust has this weird little locking nylon nut that you do have to use. All right, so before I go back and do the other side, I do want to correct how this does go together. Now, this is the KYB gas adjust. rear shock, and I think it'd be the same if you had the KYB GR2s also, but there is definitely a way this is supposed to go together. So each packet will come with these brass washers here, and then they will come with these like silver or like steel washers, I mean, here. And then you will have two different bushings. And if you look at this bushing, this one is pretty much the same on both sides. You can see it's just flat there, and it's also flat there. That will be the first one that'll go on after you obviously put the washer on there. And this other bushing, which I missed, but I had a feeling something wasn't right. But if you look here, this bushing actually has like a little larger hole cut out right here, and that is because this is the second bushing that will go on. And then that way, this really funky nut that it comes with will slide right in through this larger steel washer and then into that bushing. So it should be much easier to start than what I was doing before. So if you do get these KYBs, that is the right way to install these. So just watch for that. The instructions that they give you aren't that great. It's kind of just a bunch of pictures with some Japanese. So I just didn't even use those, but just kind of look at those parts and you'll see how it goes back together. All right, it is another day. I got finished up with the van last night. It just got kind of dark and I was pretty dusty and dirty from working out here on the ground. So I decided to go in and get cleaned up, and I figured I'd show everybody the finished results the next day today. But here you can see we have everything back together. And in my opinion, that fitment is perfect. It definitely looks like it's right about 1.5 inch drop. Ironically, the front doesn't look that much different than it did before, because I think my theory before was that the front was sagging so much. So I think the front probably is a little lower than it might have been before. But we can definitely see on the rear, we've closed up quite a bit of that wheel gap, but it's definitely not like tucking any tires. I've driven it already just to kind of make sure everything was settled in all right. And there was no crazy bumps. It wasn't super harsh or anything like that. It was actually very comfortable to drive. Definitely firmer than it was before, and probably firmer than most vans, but not ridiculously so, where it felt like super stiff and there was definitely no bounce to it. So I am super happy. You can just kind of see here, the wheel and tire fitment is perfect as well. And I'm even happy that there's seemingly an even gap between the front and the rear, meaning the front's not higher, the rear's not higher, it's pretty flat. Now obviously if I were to put people in this thing and we go on a road trip or something like that, that rear is going to come down a little bit, but that's to be expected. But I don't think there's going to be any functionality lost from this spring setup, but I am super happy about it. So I think that should do it for the major overhauls that we've been working on with this van. You know, we started with, you know, kind of the big AC stuff and the window tint. That was kind of the first stages where I had to pay someone basically to get that work done. But there we go, shift in to drive. But we got that done, and then everything just kind of snowballed from there with getting the catalytic converter replaced since it was leaking at the flex pipe. And I did get the rear of that gasket sealed back up. As you can hear, that's good to go. Then we got the brakes taken care of. We did that 2-piston front caliper setup from the full disc brake van, so that was a pretty nice setup. And then of course we had the suspension. So we've had kind of a lot going on the last few days. And oh, we can't forget about the valve covers. We did the valve covers and the distributor O-ring to kind of seal up any of those oil leaks. So we've done a lot with this van in just about the last week or two for the most part, and I am extremely happy with how things have turned out with this van. Now, the very next video that I'm going to do is going to be the big announcement on the reason why we're doing all this work, and you know, why I wanted to make sure this van was bulletproof. So definitely stay tuned for the next video. I think I'm going to upload this video today. It's I think it's Thursday today, and I'm probably gonna have this up today, and then I'll probably have the big announcement, if you will, video up tomorrow, or maybe tonight. It just depends. But either way, the next 24 to 48 hours, I'll have the big announcement up for what we are doing. So I want to thank everybody who's watched these videos so far. I know it's a little bit different than my regular kind of mustard and mayo type stuff. I am hoping to get back and do some road reviews here soon. There's a couple roads that I haven't been able to do yet, and my Infinity is actually ready to go for some more driving. So stay tuned for that. But again, thank you all for watching so far. If you like this kind of stuff, feel free to hit the subscribe. And if you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. Thanks, and have a great day.